All right, welcome to part 3, where I will address relativism morally by contrasting its claims with its actions. Note that this part is not directed against relativists, but rather against relativism. Most relativists don't even realize that they are making truth claims, so it would not be fair to apply what I am about to say to them. Making this distinction allows me to be more professional. It also avoids the ad hominem fallacy. That is, it would be fallacious to assume that the actions of relativists accurately reflect relativism. So I will be addressing the actions of relativism, not relativists. We are in the red part of our outline right now. Before we begin, if I say I believe one thing but do another, what do I really believe? You would say that my true beliefs are shown by my actions in spite of what I say. In the same way, relativism makes 7 absolute truth claims, but if you look at its actions, you will see that it does not follow any of them. Thus, the true nature of relativism is shown by its actions. So the first truth claim of relativism is that absolute truth does not exist, yet it obligates relativists to make a long list of absolute truth claims. To see this, remember the 7 absolute truth claims that we discussed earlier. So if relativism says one thing but does another, which more accurately reflects its true nature? So we have to weigh our options, like the woman in the picture. Do we listen to what relativism says or to what it does? I think that relativism has an answer for that. Oftentimes, relativists criticize adherents of religions when they say they are loving and inclusive and then go out and act like hypocrites. For example, we all know about the Crusades or the Salem witch trials or the Inquisitions being performed in the name of a loving God. This criticism shows that relativists believe that one's actions speak more loudly than words, and they are more than ready to use this logic against Christianity. Perhaps what they didn't anticipate is that we can use that logic against relativism. So this disconnect has the effect of saying that absolute truth can't exist for you and me, but it can for relativism. This is especially the case if I make an offensive truth claim about morality, religion, or the afterlife. Then absolute truth doesn't exist. But of course, absolute truth can exist for relativism and for those who agree with it. Now, at this point, some may accuse this of having the fallacy of contradicting premises, which is using contradicting premises to support the same conclusion. An example is saying, if God can do anything, then he can make a stone so heavy that he can't lift it. These contradict each other because if God can do anything, then a stone that he couldn't lift doesn't exist. So this is fallacious. And on the surface, it may appear that I am doing the same thing, because I cite as evidence for my view both the truth claims of relativism and the actions that contradict them. But note who makes the contradiction. It is relativism, not me. From my point of view, it is perfectly possible to make a truth claim and then not follow it. Unfortunately, this happens all the time, and there is nothing fallacious about pointing that out. So it is relativism that contradicts itself. No contradiction is made on my part. The second truth claim of relativism is that God does not exist. Remember that God cannot exist because if he did, then so would absolute truth. That is what relativism says, yet it affirms God's existence by its actions. To see this, I will be referencing a separate video series of mine called The Argument from Absolutes. It's about 33 minutes total, so if you want to see what I'm about to say in more detail, please watch that. In effect, relativism says God can't exist for you so that you can't make truth claims that I don't like, but he can exist for me so that I can make whatever truth claim I want. So what is this argument from absolutes? It starts by defining something called absolute behavior. Absolute behavior is behavior that cannot theoretically change. It is simply how something that is absolutely true behaves. For example, the first truth claim of relativism, which is that absolute truth does not exist, behaves absolutely because that claim cannot theoretically change for anyone, anywhere. If it did, then absolute truth could exist. So relativism accepts the existence of absolute behavior when it makes absolute truth claims. I then said that absolute behavior needs an explanation. That is, absolute truth claims must behave absolutely for a reason. They cannot justify themselves. I called this explanation X, since we do not know what it is yet. I then deduced that X is a monotheistic God, very similar to the one of the Bible. I did this by deriving its attributes. Since I don't have the time to derive them here, I will give an intuitive example to show how I did it. If I observe that a nail is driven into a 4x4, I can deduce that it didn't get there on its own. Something had to have driven it in. We can also deduce that whatever was used to drive it in must have certain attributes. For example, it probably has a hard head, a long skinny handle for weight distribution, and is heavy at one end. So we know that the nail's X has the attributes of a hammer. Likewise, I deduced that absolute behavior's X has the attributes of a monotheistic God. What were these attributes? Well, X needs to be uncaused, without a beginning, immaterial, supernatural, infinitely powerful, singular, not part of the universe, sovereign, willful, alive, timeless, eternal, immutable, rational, and extra-logical. And if you want to see these attributes defended, go to parts 4 and 6 of the argument from absolutes. And this argument is similar to what is called the transcendental argument in apologetics, so you can also research that. So I concluded that X is very similar to God. And if X is a source of absolute behavior and X is God, then God needs to exist to explain absolute behavior. This behavior is needed to make any truth claim absolute. Ironically, this includes the truth claim of relativism that God does not exist. Specifically, the attribute of X being singular shows that all truth has a common source. So if one denies truth in any way, then they have just denied its source X. If they have denied X, then they have denied all truth, since X is the source of all truth. This is a fourth reason that I alluded to in part 1. One cannot be a moral relativist only. To reject moral truth is to reject all truth, because truth has a singular source. So X is God. Why is this important? Because it shows that relativism presupposes the very God it intends to destroy. Therefore, relativism defeats itself. Again, if you want to hear this in more detail, go to the Arguments from Absolutes video series. So once again, the true nature of relativism is revealed, for it says that God does not exist, yet if you look at its actions, it assumes that God does exist, because only a being like God can make the truth of its claims absolute. The effect is that God can't exist for other people, because if he did, then they could make absolute truth claims that relativism disagrees with. But he can't exist for relativism to justify its truth claims. At this point, one might object, saying, how can relativism rely on a God that it doesn't even want to exist? In other words, how could an atheistic worldview be relying on God's existence? I have 3 answers to this. Answer number 1 is that the reliance for most relativists is not active. That is, they don't realize that they rely on God's existence. So it is possible to outwardly deny God, but subconsciously accept him. But even if their reliance was active, if they believed that God was needed to make their arguments absolute, that brings us to the second answer. Just because you actively rely on something does not mean you want it to exist. Throughout history, there have been many who have begrudgingly accepted God's existence, not because they want him to exist, but because for them the evidence was so convincing. And it is possible in the case of the relativist to know that God exists without wanting him to exist. Answer number 3 will come later when we examine the third truth claim of relativism. Just so you know, we are still in part 3, where we are revealing the true nature of relativism through its actions. I will continue this trend for the remaining 5 absolute truth claims of relativism. The third truth claim of relativism is that man's ability to discern truth is limited. That is what relativism says, But if we look at its actions, we see that it elevates man's ability to discern truth. For example, the relativist must be discerning enough to know that God does not exist. Allowing relativists to discern truth, but not its opponents, has the effect of saying, your ability to discern truth is limited, but not mine. Relativism effectively says, I will elevate myself to the status of making whatever truth claim I want, but you who disagree with me can't do that because you're not discerning enough. So once again, the true nature of relativism is revealed by its actions. So how does relativism elevate man? Well, as we have seen, relativism makes many truth claims. The only difference between a relativist truth claim and the truth claims that Christians make is that Christians make truth claims based on the authority of what they believe is God's word. But relativism doesn't believe in absolute standards like God's word, so its truth claims are based on the authority of man. Now, I am not saying, at least not here, that the Bible is God's word. My point is that Christians think it is God's word, so they don't make their truth claims by their own authority. This differs from relativism, where man's authority is considered sufficient to make an absolute truth claim. And as we will see, when this is done, humility goes out the door. Let's start with the first truth claim of relativism, which is that absolute truth does not exist. This means that man must be supremely intelligent to know beyond a shadow of a doubt that that claim is true. If he wasn't supremely intelligent, there is a chance that he is wrong, in which case the truth claim would not be absolute. Note that Christians make absolute truth claims of their own, but they are based on the supreme intelligence and wisdom of what they think is God, not man. Relativism also claims that God does not exist. For man to know this on his own authority, he would have to observe every event, every last detail in the universe to confirm that God does not exist. If he doesn't, then there is a chance that God does exist, in which case his truth claim that God does not exist would not be absolute. But for man to confirm this, he would need to be omniscient or all-knowing. He would have to possess an infinite knowledge of the universe to be absolutely sure that God does not exist. Note that it is logically impossible to prove that something doesn't exist. So the type of knowledge a relativist claims to have extends beyond logic. It is an infinite sort of knowing, a seeing of all things, a knowledge not only of current events, but also of future events and of their theoretical outcomes. This is most accurately described as omniscience. Now, some relativists might say, well, I'm not completely sure that God doesn't exist. I just haven't seen any convincing evidence for him. But this is more like skepticism, not relativism. Relativism says there is no truth, period, and denying God is part of that. God absolutely cannot exist in relativism. So their statement extends beyond saying, I just haven't seen the evidence yet, into the realm of absolute certainty. And since it is absolute, the relativist must be omniscient to know that. So man claims to be sufficiently intelligent to make claims that require omniscience. Does that sound like humility? Does that sound like the feeble-minded, weak mankind who can't discern truth? I would say not, but there is more. Not only does relativism claim to know what absolute truth is, it also claims that man is the source of that truth. This is especially the case with moral values. For example, you may have heard it said that it is up to each person to look within themselves and find out what is morally right for them. But if he is a source of absolute truth, then he is also the source of its behavior, or absolute behavior. Does that sound familiar? Man is claiming to be X. This slide comes from previously, where the attributes that are needed to make things absolutely true were derived. The attributes are listed in the red boxes. They are to be uncaused, have no beginning, immaterial, supernatural, infinitely powerful, singular, not part of the universe, sovereign, willful, alive, timeless, eternal, immutable, rational, and extra-logical. These are the attributes that are traditionally given to God, and they need to belong to X for it to make any truth claim absolute. Now, relativism elevates man to being the source of absolute truth. If that is the case, then he is also responsible for how that truth behaves. So man is now effectively claiming to have these attributes. And let's not forget being supremely intelligent and omniscient from the previous slide. Why is this the case? Because man is claiming to do something that only God can do, which is to make something absolutely true. Therefore, relativism elevates man to the position of God. Now, which type of relativism one adheres to affects who they elevate to the position of God. It just depends on who is ultimately responsible for defining truth. Some think that truth is defined by societies, so they elevate societies to the position of God. Others, and this is becoming increasingly popular, say that truth is defined at an individual level, so they elevate themselves to the position of God. Of course, they won't consciously admit it like the Roman emperors would, but that is effectively what they are saying. If you remember back in part 5, there was an objection raised saying, how can relativism rely on a God that it doesn't even want to exist? That is, how can an atheistic worldview rely on God's existence? It turns out that relativism has an answer for this. You make man God. How does this work? Well, relativism implies the existence of God when it makes absolute truth claims. That was the argument from absolutes. It then inserts man into the role of God in order to justify those truth claims. That is, relativism elevates man to the position of God so he can rely on his own authority to justify his truth claims. That way, relativism can make truth claims without having to give God the credit. This is like plagiarism, which is the act of presenting another's work or ideas as your own. Relativism presents its claims of absolute truth as originating from man, but that work is a work of God, not man, and we are not to take credit for it. Relativism even elevates man to the position of God. This is like a student writing a paper and plagiarizing the work of their professor. But they don't stop at plagiarism. They even pretend to have the attributes of that professor, so that anyone who asks them about their plagiarized work will not have any doubts. In the same way, relativism endows its adherents with the attributes of God so that no one questions the absolute truth claims that they have plagiarized. So we see the dishonesty. If you believe in relativism, I am not attacking you. I am attacking relativism. Most of the time, plagiarism is done by accident, and relativism's case is no different. Most relativists don't even think that God exists, let alone that they are effectively claiming to be him. So putting this all together, the third truth claim of relativism is that man's ability to discern truth is limited. Yet if we look at the actions of relativism, we see that it elevates man's ability to discern truth to the point that man can say, on his own authority, that something is absolutely true. Not only is man capable of discerning truth, he is actually capable of creating it. And since that is something that only God can do, this is a claim to deity. This is convenient because if man claims to be God, then that allows him to rely on his own authority rather than on the authority of God to make his absolute truth claims. This has the effect of telling others that their ability to discern truth is limited, but not mine. That is, relativism grants its followers the exclusive privilege of discerning truth. So if you agree with relativism, you can discern truth, but not so if you disagree with it. Then your ability is limited. And if you agree with relativism and make your own truth, you now possess the attributes of God that are required to do that. But not so if you disagree with relativism. Then you are merely mortal. That is truth claim number 3. The fourth truth claim of relativism is that it is arrogant to make an absolute truth claim. That is what relativism says. Yet as we see by that statement and by the content in parts in this part previously, relativism makes many absolute truth claims. Therefore, it meets its own criteria for arrogance. And as we saw, since that claim is made on the authority of man, it is especially arrogant. So once again, the true nature of relativism is revealed by its actions. It shows that it does not practice what it preaches. This is like the man in the picture who is angry at the other guy, but doesn't know that the other guy is his own reflection in the mirror. In the same way, relativism points the finger at those who make absolute truth claims, calling them arrogant. But the making of truth claims simply mirrors what relativism does. The effect of this is that you, meaning the ones that relativism disagrees with, can't make truth claims, but the relativist can. The fact that it makes any truth claims is enough to defeat it, and its true nature is revealed by the fact that it does not practice any of them. That was claim number 4. The fifth truth claim of relativism is that we should be inclusive to other ideas. That is what relativism says, but if we look at its actions, we see that it is just as exclusive as the worldviews that it criticizes. This has the effect of saying, you should be inclusive of my ideas, but I don't have to be inclusive of yours. To see the exclusivity of relativism, let's ask the question, who must be wrong if relativism is correct? Well, anyone who makes an absolute truth claim would be wrong. This includes scientists, theologians, historians, philosophers, mathematicians, most religious people, and anyone with a sense of absolute morality. And let's not forget relativists. Not only would these types of people be wrong currently, but they would also be wrong in all of mankind's history. The point is that if relativism is correct, then the vast majority of the world, both past and present, is wrong, which makes relativism just as exclusive as the views that it criticizes. And that is just the first truth claim of relativism. There are 6 others that are mentioned here, and there are additional ones that tend to be made about politics and religion. My point is that as the number of truth claims goes up, so does the exclusivity of the worldview that they comprise. So relativism makes more than enough truth claims to meet its own definition of exclusiveness. To further illustrate my claim, relativists will often give this analogy that sounds something like this. So there's an elephant and a bunch of blind people are feeling it. One feels the legs and says, truth is like a tree. Another feels a trunk and says, no, you're wrong. Truth is soft and has air flowing through it. Yet another feels a stomach and says, no, you're all wrong. Truth is big and broad and moves up and down. And this is a depiction of anyone who claims to know what truth is. They know nothing more than a blind person feeling an elephant would. On the surface, this analogy seems like a very humble position because it does not appear to make any truth claims. But let's look closer. In this analogy, who has sight and who is blind? Is not the vast majority of the world blind, and the relativist the only one that has sight? That is, if one could not see, then how could one know that the rest of the world is blind? In other words, relativism claims that only relativists know the entire truth. Only they know that there is an elephant, and that the rest of the world is only aware of part of the truth. It is ironic that relativism, in its quest for inclusiveness, claims to be the world's sole source of truth, which, besides being self-defeating, is by its own logic not an inclusive statement. This has the effect of when someone says something that relativism disagrees with, they are told to be inclusive. But relativism grants itself an exception to this rule when it excludes the vast majority of the world. The 6th truth claim of relativism is that we should treat all ideas equally. That is what relativism says, but if we look at its actions, we see that it treats its own belief with bias. This has the effect of saying, I can judge your ideas in an unbiased way, but you can't do that to my ideas. It becomes relevant here to define bias. Bias is systematic error, so consistently erring in the same way. We see bias in relativism when it systematically accepts the evidence that supports it as being absolutely true, but systematically dismisses any opposing evidence as quote-unquote relative. So remember the philosophical, historical, and moral evidence in part 2? Those truths, according to relativism, are absolutely true. Yet any evidence that is presented against relativism is dismissed as being relative. Remember, according to relativism, no absolute truth exists, so it should not be accepting any truth claims, including the ones that support it. Is it a coincidence that the truth claims relativism deems absolute just so happen to be the same ones that support it, and the truth claims that it deems relative just so happen to be the ones that oppose it? Do you see the bias? If you don't, you will see it if you debate a relativist. They will usually make a long list of absolute truth claims concerning things like universal acceptance and tolerance, but the moment you mention opposing evidence, that evidence is relative and can be ignored. To be completely transparent, relativism ought to say, I ignore conflicting evidence by classifying it as relative. In other words, I am tolerant only to the evidence that supports me. This absolute refusal to consider opposing belief systems is a moral fault because it shows a double standard, but it also results in a logical fault, which is that relativism is non-falsifiable. This simply means that there is no way within relativism for it to be proven false. This is because the moment you try to prove it false, your evidence is dismissed as being quote-unquote relative. In science, a non-falsifiable idea would be thrown out immediately because it cannot be tested. Yet relativism is tolerated by much of our present culture. So once again, the true nature of relativism is revealed by its actions. The seventh and last truth claim of relativism is that we are morally obligated to obey the truth. This is what relativism says, yet if we look at its actions, we see that relativism exempts itself from the truth. Remember the non-falsifiability of relativism? Even if sound evidence was presented against it, the relativist could not recognize it. They can't recognize it because relativism does not permit it. Under relativism, the relativist must consider all truths to be relative, opposing evidence included, and this is all while accepting its own truth claims as absolute. So once again, relativism defeats itself through its actions. It says one thing and does another. The effect of this is that relativism says, you must follow the truth, but I don't have to. So we see that relativism meets its own criteria for being arrogant and exclusive, and has the logical problems of being biased and non-falsifiable. We are nearing the end of part 3, where I showed the true nature of relativism through its actions. But let's summarize what we have covered so far. This slide summarizes the ways in which relativism defeats itself. The left-hand table is from part 2 and lists the 7 truth claims of relativism. All of these contradict its core belief that absolute truth does not exist. Each time relativism makes a truth claim, it defeats itself. So relativism defeats itself logically in at least 7 ways. Of course, if the relativist wants to get into politics and religion, they are welcome to add to that number. The right-hand table summarizes part 3, which contrasts relativism's 7 truth claims with its actions. Remember, these actions are inherent to relativism and did not target relativists. This allowed me to avoid a fallacy and to show that it truly was the nature of relativism I was revealing, and not of any relativist. Relativism claims that absolute truth does not exist, yet makes many absolute truth claims. Relativism claims that God does not exist, yet presupposes God's existence to make their truth claims absolute. Relativism claims that man's ability to discern truth is limited, yet elevates the truth-discerning ability of its own adherents, even allowing them to replace God as the source of truth. Relativism claims that it is arrogant to make an absolute truth claim, yet makes many absolute truth claims. Relativism claims that we should be inclusive to other ideas, yet is itself one of the most exclusive ideas there is. Relativism claims that we should treat all ideas equally, yet gives biased treatment to itself. Relativism claims that we are morally obligated to obey the truth, yet it grants itself an exception from the evidence, dismissing all opposing claims as relative. And for any truth claim that it does not practice, relativism defeats itself morally because it does not obey its own moral standard. I listed 7 such truth claims, so relativism morally defeats itself in 7 ways. That brings the total number to 14, 7 logical and 7 moral. So to summarize, relativism makes at least 7 absolute truth claims, but does not allow or follow any of them. This forces us to choose between its words and its actions. Which is more reliable? I say, and I think most relativists would agree, that actions speak more loudly than words. So it is ironic that the antithesis of relativism is a religious worldview that makes absolute truth claims about everything, is arrogant, exclusive, and biased, and does not care about the evidence. Yet as I showed, that is the very kind of worldview that relativism is. Thus, relativism appears to be the exact opposite of what it actually is. By accusing the enemy of what it is guilty of, relativism shifts the focus away from itself, thus allowing its hypocrisy to go undetected. So what are the implications of this? The first one is to not judge a worldview by its words alone. Look at its actions, and if the two conflict, go with the actions because they reveal its true nature. Despite what it claims to be, relativism does not do away with absolute standards. Far from it. All it does is reject the absolute standard that once was in place, that is, what was thought to be God's word, and substitutes it with what is thought to be an absolute standard of its own, man's word. And this standard, like any other, has its own set of rules and regulations that everyone must adhere to, all while denying that truth exists. And this substitution of standards is very convenient for someone who would quite frankly prefer it if God did not exist and would rather be self-sufficient. This leads to the second implication, which concerns the motivations behind relativism. They are not what most people think they are. Let's look at some potential motivations. How about logic or sound reasoning? Well, if that were the case, it would not defeat itself in the 14 or so ways mentioned. How about moral virtues, like being inclusive or practicing humility? Well, if those were the motivation, it would practice those things. As it is, relativism is motivated more by the desire to have personal freedom and to live with no restraints. That is why relativism allows its own followers to make truth claims, but denies that chance to its opponents. This double standard allows its followers to do whatever they want, with no chance of being challenged. I say this not to bash relativists. Most relativists legitimately think that they are being inclusive and humble, and many of them are those things. So I want you to meet them in that spot and have compassion, knowing that it is the belief you are judging, not its adherence. That is the end of part 3. In part 4, I will make relativism relevant by discussing its influence on the modern Christian church.